Welcome to the Exploress, time traveling through women's history, one era at a time. I'm Kate Armstrong. Why, hello. I'm sorry to be bringing you my sniffly, cold-laden voice right now, but I didn't want to delay this episode any longer. Welcome back to the Exploress Book Club, where I talk to authors of historical fiction about their incredible novels and find out what they learned along the way about women of the past. Today, I'm joined by Natasha Solomons to talk about her book, I Am Cleopatra, which whisks us back into the ancient past to explore Cleo's story from her point of view. So, grab your crook and flail and let's go traveling. But first, a shout out to some of my patrons. My warrior queens, Alexis, Amanda, MCF, Amy, Kate, Ika, Jessie, June, Neve and Sloan, and Sarah. My imperial empresses, Faye and Whimsy Soapworks, Alyssa, Letitia, Sally, Samara, and Teresa. And my lady pharaohs, Bridget, Kot, Kate, Kimberly, Laura, Lori, Sophie, and the fabulous Courtneys. Patrons fuel the Exploress in a big way. As an independent creator, I couldn't do this work without them. For just a few bucks a month, they get all episodes early and ad-free, hours of exclusive bonus episodes, behind-the-scenes peeks, the chance to become voice acting stars, and the warm and fuzzy feeling of knowing they're helping keep this show alive. You can even try it for free for 7 days. To find out more, just click on the link in my show notes. Now, one more quick note before we get started. I have to admit that I had a microphone malfunction during my chat with Natasha, which I was completely unaware of until I went to edit this audio. So while I am perfectly understandable, the quality isn't as good as it usually is, so please forgive me.
Hello, Natasha, and welcome to the Exploress.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited. I'm not quite finished, but I am so close to being finished with your amazing book. I've been so immersed and having such an amazing time reading it. So that is what we were talking about today. I think it's fair to say, looking at your body of work, that you really specialize in feminist retellings, is what I'm going to call them. So you give women who history and literature tends to silence a new and refreshing voice. So you took us into the mind of Mona Lisa. You wrote a book about Rosaline from Romeo and Juliet fame. But I want to know what specifically inspired you to want to tell the story of Cleopatra. What actually took you to her?
Really came at Cleopatra sideways because, as you said, I'd written this novel, Fair Rosaline, which was a sort of untelling of Romeo and Juliet and sort of told from the point of view of Rosaline, Romeo's first love. And in my version of it, sort of Romeo's this kind of dastardly sort of groomer of young girls. And I had so much fun sort of writing in another writer's imagination, sort of playing in Shakespeare's world, that when I finished Rosaline, I was sort of thinking, well, I'd quite like to tell another kind of Shakespeare adjacent story, something else that's sort of inspired by Shakespeare. So I went back through and I was rereading the plays, and I reread Antony and Cleopatra, which as a play I do love, but it's really problematic that, if I say it sort of fails the Bechdel test, you know what I mean? So for anybody who's not clear what the Bechdel test is, it's when you have two female characters in a scene doing something other than talking about a boy. And Antony and Cleopatra, hands down, fails the Bechdel test. That Cleopatra, we're told, is this remarkable politician and sort of maneuverer. And yet, in almost every scene, she's with the ladies of her court saying, does Antony still fancy me? Does he? Because I'm worried that I'm getting a bit old. Does he fancy me still? She does it in the most beautiful iambic pentameter known to man, but that is essentially the content. And that completely infuriated me. And I then went and read Julius Caesar again, which, confess, is not my favorite play. I've argued about this a lot with kind of Shakespeare sort of scholar friends. But from my point of view, there's a lot of men in rooms talking about it, talking to each other very earnestly. And the women's stories are much better, but Shakespeare doesn't include them. And it doesn't include Cleopatra. Who misses Cleopatra out of the story? It's the most bewildering creative decision. So very meandering answer. But essentially, I came to sort of writing my Cleopatra thinking, well, I want to kind of re-engage with Shakespeare. And initially I thought I'm going to write this really kind of claustrophobic, almost domestic novel, if you could have a domestic novel with Cleopatra in, just set in Rome in the lead up to the Ides of March, a kind of inversion of Julius Caesar where we see all of those scenes, but just from the women's point of view. So I started that and that didn't work. It just didn't work. We couldn't invest or really understand Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra until we'd gone back to Alexandria. So we had to kind of meet Cleopatra as a kind of young, much more sort of vulnerable girl, young woman, and sort of encounter her sort of that way. So it sort of evolved out of this Shakespearean retelling. I think now you'd be quite hard pushed kind of really see how this kind of started as a kind of conversation with Julius Caesar. But that was the way in.
That's so interesting to me too. That makes some of the decisions that you make in the book that we will talk about a couple questions from now make like it puts them in a whole new light for me. So I find that really exciting. So let's start then. So we're talking about inspiration. We're talking about kind of how you came to Cleopatra. So I would imagine you're taking us back to the ancient world. You're taking us really far back in history. And I know, making a show about women's history and having read a lot about the ancient world, it's really difficult to really find women in the ancient world. They get mentioned and they often get maligned. Obviously, all the writers are men. Like all the voices who come to us are men. So I would imagine that it's an interesting challenge when you're writing fiction, but you're writing about a very real woman who really lived, but we only get her through the eyes of men. How did you even begin to approach getting to know Cleopatra? How much did you know about her going in, and how did you go about researching who she was?
Well, my first stage was panic because as I said, my way in was Shakespeare, but actually that's you need a lot more than that. And it turns out there's an awful lot of people who know a lot about Rome. I was not one of them.
Uh,
I was massively, massively intimidating. So, I mean, I went back and I kind of, yes, I read Plutarch and try and sort of approach the ancient sources. But I'd say as a writer of fiction, it's both terrifying and also liberating that what we actually know, the kind of the bare facts in some ways, because they're quite lean, it gives you this freedom to kind of, yeah, to elaborate and embroider and create your version of. And I read the sort of more modern, I suppose, feminist historians, their sort of biographies of Cleopatra. And after all, you read enough that they all sort of, you know, they contradict, and as soon as you get multiple views of something, it's actually, again, it just gives you a freedom. You think, well, that's fine. I've got this myriad view of what might have happened. I'm going to choose my version. And I'm not a historian. I'm not saying this is what happened and here is all my evidence. Here are my sources. The balance of probability in the version that I'm creating, I believe X. You're saying, well, not only this is what might have happened as serves my narrative, but I really want to get into how it felt when it happened. So if I give you an example, like the moment where Cleopatra is brought to Caesar. And historians sort of argue, was she brought in a linen basket? Was she wrapped up in a carpet? And all of that kind of hinges on the translation of a Greek word. And you can kind of argue this way, argue that way. Historians can reach a consensus or they can argue. I'm not that worried. What interests me is what did the young queen, probably about 19, almost certainly a virgin at that time, what did she feel? What was going through her head when she's carried and she's brought to Caesar? And I think that's the difference between kind of historical fiction and history, because fiction writers can go to the places where historians, it's much more difficult for them to go. And we can really explore what might have felt like. And of course, she lived a really long time ago. And we are always sort of, peering through the glass darkly. But we can try and imagine what it might have felt. And I think that's sort of a gift that fiction can bring to history, that these sort of places that we dare to go, that is more difficult for historians.
And one of the things I love about that moment when she's journeying to go and see Caesar and she already knows what she's going to need to do to get into his favor is that she is menstruating during
Yes.
that trip and which I absolutely loved this detail for a lot of reasons. One, we don't see enough, we don't see enough menstruation, I don't think, in historical narratives. It's like, you know what, people were menstruating all the time and they were uncomfortable sometimes, and we should talk about it. But I just love the vulnerability of this woman who's a living goddess. She's a queen. She's in the desert. She's in a desperate situation. Her people are dying every day in the desert. So much hinges upon what she does next. And she knows she's going to have to go and see this powerful man and seduce him. But as you say, she's a virgin, first of all. Second of all, she's got cramps. She's bleeding. And she knows that if Julius Caesar finds out she's bleeding, he's not going to want to sleep with her because there's super Roman superstition things about that. And so she and her, trusted woman servant or, sort of best friend servant helps her to conceal the fact that she's menstruating. And to me, like you say, that is the gift of historical fiction is she felt so human in that moment. And I really felt like I knew something about her and like I could understand what it might have been like to be her.
And I think for me, that was one of the first scenes in the book that I wrote because it was a kind of, aha, okay, now I can find and empathize with my Cleopatra. Because when you write figures sort of from history who are so iconic, so well known, there's a real distance. And as you said, Cleopatra sort of thought of herself as a living goddess. She's sort of pharaoh. She's got, in some ways, in that moment in the desert, she's powerless. But in other times, she's so powerful. She's quite unreachable, even in her sense of herself as a goddess. And I thought, I have to find a way to bring her to earth. And it has to feel true, because if you bring her to earth too much, well, then she just feels modern and she doesn't feel like Cleopatra at all. She has to still be an ancient queen. And one of the differences to me between ancient queens and ancient kings is that ancient queens bleed. And women's bodies, particularly at that time, have an inherent vulnerability that men's don't. And in that moment when sort of Cleopatra is really, she understands that her body is a political tool, that there is no gap between politics and body politic. It is all part of the same. Her body is a lever of power and she has to use it. But in this moment, that lever of power is kind of letting her down because, as you say, ancient men really don't like bleeding women. It, really freaks them out. And so it's this sort of this pivotal moment in history. It's like, what if? And I think you could always go through your sort of head when you're reading it, thinking, well, what if he did find out? What if it went completely a different direction just because this queen had her period at the wrong time? And I think those kind of what ifs, even if they're just kind of left hanging there for the reader, they are quite interesting.
Absolutely. And I think too, because as I said before, pretty much all of Cleopatra's story, we don't have any of her words. We don't have a secret diary, unfortunately. All we have are the words of men, and often men who saw her as a foreigner and an enemy to tell us what she was like. And so we get no emotion, really. We only get strategy. We only get kind of like what other people put on her. And so you make her like extraordinary and larger than life, but she's also very human. So in doing all of the reading and the research that you did about Cleopatra, was there anything specific that you learned about her or just about life for women in Egypt or the ancient world that really surprised you or interested you?
I suppose I really like the thought of Cleopatra's early education because she really received a sort of a prince's education, the same as her brothers, one for a future king or a future queen. And the thought of the young Cleopatra in the great library of Alexandria, to me, that's a kind of intoxicating image. And the thought that her reading primer was sort of the original works of Plato in his own hand, same as Aristotle. And yet, and the fact of the library itself, where you have the kind of the sort of the legacy of the Ptolemies, who've been collecting these manuscripts to try and create this incredible library, the kind of the greatest in the world. And my favorite, I think, was the ship collection, which has nothing to do with ships. It's just all the manuscripts that the Ptolemies over the years have confiscated from ships coming into Alexandria Harbor. And so on the one hand, you have the sense of Cleopatra learning in this sort of cutting edge library where they're discovering mathematics and philosophy. And yet also in the library, which of course is, the Mausian or the museum, sort of temple of the muses, there's also the egg that Helen of Troy hatched out of. And me, it just sort of encapsulates that moment in history where you have this sort of self-awareness of those scholars in Alexandria that, yes, we are operating at the cutting edge of thought. We have all the literature in the world gathered into one place. We're pushing the boundaries of our understanding of what we would now call science. Yet that sits in total comfort and harmony with magic and notions of sort of goddesses and divinity. And there's no separation between science and magic, because actually when you boil water and it turns into a gas and disappears, well, that is magic. Sure, call it science, but it's magic. And I think that sort of really neatly encapsulates my kind of vision of the ancient world of this place and this acceptance where Cleopatra is a politician, she's a maneuverer and a goddess and a mother, and she's all of those things. And she understands that with a kind of harmony and without a kind of, splitting of self that we perhaps as kind of modern readers struggle with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, she uses magic in order to kind of help create this aura around herself. And she really does in the book, as you imagine she did in life, really believe that she is a goddess on earth, and yet she still is very human, and those things live side by side in her character. It's so interesting. So when it comes to Cleopatra, I feel like she's one of those women from history, more than almost any other, who is just slathered with layers of rumor and hearsay. And I'm sure that, you could do a survey of people on the street who are interested in history, and you could say, like, what have you heard about Cleopatra? And you would hear wild things about how she bathed in, ass's milk, and how she had a poison school where she, learned the art of poison so she could poison all the people, including herself. And, just the snakes, the things about the snakes. Just feel like she's so wrapped up in these like larger than life rumors. You had so much of that material to work with, but very little that we know for sure about Cleopatra. So how did you, as the author of this book, decide like what rumors and stories were you going to keep and which ones were you just going to chuck over your shoulder?
I mean, I think the first part of sort of trying to separate Cleopatra from the myth is almost impossible because it's sort of so many layers of it. And the myths start early that they almost start with Cleopatra herself, because she has this sense that part of her power base is sort of creating a self myth of herself as Isis, the living goddess. So in the same way as something like Taylor Swift or Beyonce or even a politician kind of has to don that aspect of power, or perhaps, Elizabeth I, or even the kind of the modern family, royal family, when they're going into kind of a state dinner. Well, without all his regal crown and sort of paraphernalia of state, Charles is just kind of some old dude in his 70s. I mean, he could be anyone. And it's only when you put that paraphernalia around that this person becomes king. And I think that Cleopatra really understood that in order to seem that sort of living goddess and to have that power of her over her people, she has to become the goddess. So I think the first part of the myth is of her sort of self-creation. And so when I was writing about that, I tried to kind of have that sort of sense where we see Cleopatra creating that myth along with the women, her friends, and the sort of slave girls who serve her. So Charmian and Iras, who kind of dress her and turn her into this sort of this queen and this self, but also take it off her at night. So, and we actually hear her complain about just the weight of this gold headdress and like the headaches it gives, and how, she literally bleeds as it sort of cuts into her skin. And so it both comes at a cost, and there's a sense of kind of putting on this mantle and then removing it later. So I think that's sort of the first layer of myth. But then there's also the myth of the kind of the Roman and Greek writers who come afterwards. And of course, history, as we know, tends to be written by the victors, and certainly their voices are the loudest. And Cleopatra ultimately loses. So it is those Roman historians who tell her fate, and they really don't like her. And They don't like her because she's foreign, because she's a queen. She's a foreign queen, sort of both of those together. And so when they sort of talk about her, it's sort of in these really sort of sexualized terms that how could she have sort of corrupted the great Roman Marcus Antonius, and the sort of exoticization of the East. It's not new. The Romans did it. This sort of it was both eroticized as well as being sort of the exotic. And they sort of cast Cleopatra in that myth even then. And it's sort of funny to when you read it because she's an enemy, they were defeated, she was defeated. They have to make sort of the Romans sound wonderful. And yet, if they denigrate Cleopatra too far, well then beating her doesn't mean as much. So it's this kind of this inward struggle of she was terrible, she was the worst. Yet we were amazing in how we defeated her because she was in some ways sort of a worthy enemy, even though she was still rubbish. So you're kind of trying to kind of swim through all these layers. And then when you get to modern times, I mean, this sort of continues literally over the millennia. And then you come to modern times and you've got to engage with Elizabeth Taylor and, quite some eyeliner. And then the kind of French romantic paintings. And it is really difficult. And you're kind of trying to peer through. And as you said, what we actually have about her, we have sort of some bare facts and things we know, but we don't know what she felt about it. So when I kind of make those decisions of trying to find looking at sort of the history of what we do know, there's always a sense of who is the Cleopatra that I'm trying to create? Who is the Cleopatra that we need for this moment in time for us? And which of these kind of various stories or various competing facts serves the story that I am trying to tell the best? Because, of course, this isn't the story of Cleopatra. There are multiple stories. This is mine. That's all I can ever present. And it's just trying to pull out the pieces and create the version that sort of supports the one that I am trying to tell.
And it's interesting that you talk about kind of crafting a Cleopatra for the current moment. So, in writing for a modern audience and bringing us this ancient queen who we all think we know, but we don't really know at all. What were some of your objectives? What version of Cleopatra did you really want to give us, and what do you think makes her so relevant even now?
I think it's dangerous to say that she's relevant
Mm.
because I think there's, in some ways, that is trying to turn her into a modern woman. And one of the things about Cleopatra, I think we always have to bear in mind that she is an ancient queen and she believes that she's a living goddess. She has a relaxed attitude to things like murder, probably today would make us uncomfortable.
And slavery, obviously, as
And
well.
slavery, yeah, she just accepts those things. And so I think there's sort of, one has to really see her as sort of on her own terms in her own world as sort of part of that. And it always feels like you're sort of tracing this sort of tightrope walk where trying to bring her down to earth so that a modern reader can empathize with her journey. And I think there's something intoxicating about the idea of Cleopatra, particularly at this moment where there's so much toxic masculine politics that I think we really crave a powerful queen.
Mhm.
And to see the way that she operates in this world of men is really fascinating and I think speaks to us in this moment. And we kind of crave a modern day Cleopatra. But I think that whilst creating this version of her, I felt that I really had to make sure that she still felt like an ancient queen. And there are aspects of her that are sort of slightly unreachable, untouchable, like those kind of the attitudes and things that we mentioned. But the people of her own time don't judge her for that. That in many ways her murdering of her siblings is, I mean, it's a very sensible political choice. She doesn't really have she doesn't have a choice about it. They're trying to kill her. It's sort of whoever sort of manages first wins. Um, but again, that's a sort of historical reality that we can look at. But then again, the role of the novelist is to say, yes, well, that might have been a political reality, but she was still a human being. So how did she feel about that? And to then sort of acknowledge that she must have had sort of an emotional response to it, and nobody is all one thing. And to sort of both look at the political decision and the personal cost of those.
So there are a couple of other really interesting historical women who show up in this novel. One of them is Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe, who I thought it was great that you gave us a Cleopatra who actually cared for her younger sister and was very sad when they fell out and things went how they went, because we often don't get that point of view. It was just all the siblings were rivals the end. So I loved seeing Cleopatra really, she's pretty cut up when Arsinoe turns against her in the book. But also, we have a really incredible ancient Roman woman we've met on the Explorers before. We have a whole episode about her, actually, and her name is Servilia. So I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about Servilia, who she was, and why you decided to include her voice, because you actually have her as a point of view character in this book. What made you decide to include her voice in that way?
I just loved Sevilla. I sort of fell in love with Sevilla as I was researching. So, Sevilla, for anyone who doesn't know, was sort of Caesar's long-term lover, mistress. And we don't know exactly when they sort of first met or got into a relationship. They probably knew each other as teenagers. They were certainly in a relationship when Sevilla was in her sort of, mid-20s, would you say? And what I love about sort of the Sevilla and Caesar relationship is this sort of sense that whilst they each have other partners and husbands, wives, children with other people, these other relationships sort of come and go, that they remain this constant in one another's lives. And in many ways, Sevilla, as a kind of Roman matron who sort of traded a bit like a Pokemon card in her family for power to different men. She should seem like she's sort of somebody who is powerless. And yet she makes this decision really quite early on that she's going to love Caesar. She chooses to love him. And for me, that choice to love gives her actually a huge amount of autonomy. And the one thing that Cleopatra can't choose is that she can't choose who to love. She can't choose who to give her body to. Her body is a tool of state, and she recognizes it as such. And in my story, because we don't get on to the Marcus Antonius relationship, she chooses to give her body to Caesar, and it's a political decision. So Servilia, to me, provides this sort of rather poetic counterpoint, really, to Cleopatra, where Servilia's relationship with Caesar is out of love. She doesn't have to be in a relationship with him. He has other women, and yet somehow she chooses. She sees him sort of, I think, not misty-eyed, but with kind of quite clarity. She sees his flaws. She knows that she's second to his ambition, and yet she decides to love him in this very kind of conscious act of will. And I'm also really intrigued the way that none of us are the same with sort of different people. Like with some of our friends, they bring out some aspect of our character. We're different with our partner, with our children, we're different at work. It's why we have sort of certain people in our lives, because we like who we are with them. And the Caesar we see with Servilia is very different from the Caesar we see with Cleopatra. And it's sort of different models of relationship. But there's an aspect to me of Cleopatra who is really trapped. She's really trapped by her power, that every decision she makes isn't for her as an individual. It's for her as a queen and as the role of the ruler of Egypt. And she can't make decisions for me as a woman. What do I want? Who can I love? Who can I sleep with? What are my decisions? So in some ways, what she seems incredibly powerful, she's actually completely trapped. And yet Servilia, and to another extent, another character who I really enjoyed writing is Cleopatra's sort of slave or friend, Charmian. And I've sort of, I've shifted that relationship where it's really a kind of much more equal friendship between Charmian and Cleopatra. And yet Charmian in many ways is still a slave. She's owned by Cleopatra. And yet Cleopatra makes no demands on her body. So Charmian is free to love who she wants and to give her body to who she wants. So in that regard, Charmian has a freedom that Cleopatra, as her mistress and as a queen, doesn't. And so those sort of three women, I think the sort of the differences between them and how the kind of the choices or the freedoms that each of them have and that each of them lack, I think kind of provides a kind of reflecting point for all of the others. And it's a kind of conversation between all three.
Yes, I really loved that we get the counterpoint of this woman who is very involved with Caesar, and is a woman with power and with prestige, but also who's kind of ensnared and trapped by the expectations of her culture. A very different culture than Cleopatra's dealing with, but still some of the same kind of expectations. So yeah, I loved that. I think Servilia is fascinating. I wish we had more on her. I wish we knew more. But yeah, I think her role in ancient Roman history is just so interesting, and we should talk about her more.
And I think the other part is, of course, that these two women are both mothers. And for
Mm.
all the kind of longevity of the relationship between Servilia and Caesar, the one thing that Servilia can't give Caesar is she doesn't give him a child. They don't share a child together. And Caesar sort of becomes the, if you want to say, stepfather of Servilia's son, Brutus. That Cleopatra does have Caesar's son. There's a sort of point in the novel where after sort of Caesar's death, that we have these two visions of these two different mothers and what motherhood costs us. And I mean, obviously, what motherhood costs Servilia is enormous. Her son murders her lover, and not, her lover of 6 months, her lover of probably 30 years, the sort of the great love of her life, her son. And when you see it in this sort of through the paradigm of realizing that essentially Caesar is Brutus's stepfather, I think it really sort of shifts the way you view that. And for me, that's really something that's underexplored in literature. Of I know we sort of in Julius Caesar we see Brutus, but we don't see Servilia, and we don't see what it means. And when he turns up on her doorstep, what that says, what that means to Servilia, and how she carries on from that moment, how she survives, and how she has to make that choice of, is she going to support her son? Is she going to help him in that moment? That it really feels that sort of the women's voices in general have, on that moment in history, really have been eviscerated. And it is time to look at it from their point of view, because there's stories in terms of kind of the power, the drama. I mean, it is sort of Grecian, sort of in the sense of its the scope of the tragedy. It's so enormous. And then you have Cleopatra, who's struggling to get out of Rome, and everyone wants to kill her son because he's Caesar's actually does have a son, and she's got to get out. And then these two women together, and the way that motherhood makes us vulnerable, and the vulnerability that these women feel, sort of for their
Mm.
sons. And of course, it's the great leveler is love. That no matter how much power you have, when you love, you have a vulnerability. And both of these women, their vulnerability is their love for their sons, who make terrible decisions. I mean, Caesarion doesn't because he's too little, but
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you draw so many parallels between these two women who I mean, history didn't really pit them specifically as rivals, but history does tend to pit women against each other. And both of
yes.
these women had relationships with the same powerful man. But, you really do see them as allies in a sense in your story, and I really liked that because they do share a lot in common. And the whole moment, as you say, like Shakespeare just wrote about Julius Caesar and didn't talk about Cleopatra at all, which is wild because her being in Rome with Caesarion did play a role in those final days of Julius Caesar's life. And imagine being this foreign queen who has brought Caesar's son to a hostile land. Really, this is not a place that wants her and loves her. They see queens as monarchy as anathema. Julius Caesar is murdered, and now she's trapped and surrounded on all sides by enemies. Like, how did you think about bringing that moment to life for Cleopatra?
I mean, I wanted to look at it as well. Her absolute isolation, and also the sense, I suppose, I don't want to say sort of complicity in his death, but the sense that if you're Caesar, I think it's quite hard to sort of to be with a queen and not to hanker after being a king. And there's a sort of slight sense that whether sort of deliberately or just inadvertently, that she kind of awakened this sort of last ambition in Caesar, and one that Servilia sort of senses and is appalled by, because she knows that in Rome this is disaster. And it's something that Cleopatra can't quite understand, because her culture is so different. Of course Caesar would want to be king, and she doesn't sort of take issue with that. Um, so I think that was something that I wanted to kind of to look at, that kind of the relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra and ambition, what that can say. But yeah, absolutely. And then after his death, the sort of real vulnerability and acute danger of Cleopatra's position in Rome. How is she going to leave when she is just surrounded by enemies on every side, and she is a stranger in a strange land where people really are just out to kill her and her son, because the enemies of Caesar really don't want the last heir of Caesar around, especially with his foreign mother.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it is an incredible drama, and to be able to see it through the eyes of these women who are so like have to make these really difficult choices in the midst of trauma is just it's so great. It's so great to actually read it on the page and be immersed in it. So I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about the Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony of it all. So Mark Antony and Cleopatra, probably one of the most famous love stories question mark romances of all time. Like this is, a million stories have built around these two people. And we even see it as you were talking about Elizabeth Taylor earlier. I mean, the whole thing about Elizabeth Taylor and the actor whose name has just completely flown out of my brain, Mark Antony. Anyway, this is a famous story. So how did you go about tackling that relationship? Like what version of that relationship were you interested in exploring?
Marcus Antonius is in my novel in one scene. He throws up in a helmet. Cleopatra's revolted by him and turns her back. He's not, at this point, he's still married to Fulvia. And I really wanted to focus on the relationship between Cleopatra and Caesar at this time. I think that sometimes the danger in telling Cleopatra's story, kind of fiction, is to try and attempt this cradle to grave narrative that we all know how it ends. It ends sort of with poison of some kind, possibly serpents. And I finished my story so far before that,
Mm.
that it's well before Cleopatra gets into any kind of relationship with Marcus Antonius. We sort of end before that. And it might well be that I kind of write the second part and I really get into that relationship. But it's sort of, I really wanted to write a story where we see Cleopatra on her own terms as opposed to defined by her relationships with men. And whilst, of course, I've got Caesar in this novel, I really tried to balance it by having those female characters and those female voices to add a really kind of bright counterpoint just to the relationship with Caesar. And I think it would have been, from a sort of length point of view, either everything in the first part would have had to be so compressed to give room. It felt so compromised. And for me, often when you're trying to tell a story, it's to try and find the right rhythm of this story. And to me, the right rhythm was to sort of finish the novel as I do after The Ides of March. And there's a second story to be told. And maybe I will get around to writing that one. But I feel like that's about that relationship.
Yeah.
Just kind of, because this way it just felt like I could kind of open it up and just have a chance to kind of really see the Cleopatra that I felt that we were sort of promised in Antony and Cleopatra, this sort of powerful woman on her own terms, as opposed to just seeing her through the kind of that relationship.
Yeah, and I really love that. I think that was one of the main complaints about the Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra movie, and I watched it not that long ago. I think last year I rewatched it. It is a very long movie, listeners. If you have never
Oh
watched
my
it,
God, it's so long.
It's so long. It is so long. And the thing is that the first half of the movie, which is about Caesar and Cleopatra, is, I think, by far the most compelling. But it gets, even though it's a very long movie, it gets a bit squashed because then you need all of this time to talk about Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So, like, the movie is very long, and yet still, it's like, it's really hard to tell this incredibly huge arc, and it is kind of defined by her relationships with men. So I loved in this story, there is a lot of Caesar, but it's really not about Caesar. It's about Cleopatra trying to find her, hold on to her power and navigate her power. She, from the very opening pages of the novel, it's very clear to her that her father has put her in a position, has put Egypt in a position where she has no choice but to kind of, find her way with Rome. There's no other way, and she has to find her way. And I loved that. I loved watching her kind of become the Cleopatra in some ways that we have come to know her as by the end of this novel. But we see behind the curtain of the rumor and really see her as a human too. It's an just an incredible book. It's a fantastic book, listeners, if you haven't picked it up yet. But I have one more question for you. I ask all of my guests this. It's I love it. It's a fun question. If you could time travel back in time to one time, one place for a day, you don't have to worry about disease. So don't worry about that. You'll be fine. Where would you go?
I think I'd be torn whether I would travel back. I don't know. I would love to meet Cleopatra and to travel back to her court. I'd love to go. I'd love to get her to give me a library tour of the Library of Alexandria. I think that would be amazing to spend an afternoon in the library with Cleopatra. So that would be one choice. But then I think I'd love to go and see Shakespeare, either at the Globe or maybe a more intimate performance at sort of in a temple, to watch like Twelfth Night or something in a temple. But then
Ooh,
I don't know. I'd also love to just maybe help Leonardo grind some paints whilst he was painting Lisa del Giocondo for the Mona Lisa. I think that would be quite fun as well, with all
ooh.
the kind of drunk boys in his Bottega. I think that would also be really fun. So I don't know. I think I'd write all three on a slip of paper and then I'd just put one into the time machine and see where I ended up.
I like that. A little surprise for you. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Natasha, for coming and telling us all about your incredible book, I Am Cleopatra, which you can pick up wherever good books are sold. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell us about it before you go?
So much for having me. Thank you for having me on the podcast. Because I listened to this when I was just starting my research about Cleopatra. So it feels very
Ah,
lovely and cool to be now here talking to you this morning.
that's so lovely to think that my show might have inspired you in some small way. I love it.
Thank you so much to Natasha for joining us. You can find I Am Cleopatra on shelves now. You can buy a copy of all our book club picks at my bookshop.org page. Buying there supports indie booksellers, and I get a little kickback too. You'll find a link in the show notes. If you like The Exploress, tell a friend about it. Leave a review wherever you listen, become a patron, or just shoot me a message on Instagram or an email via my website. Hearing from you really does delight me. Much love to Carly Quinn for all her help bringing this episode together. Much love to Josh Stackhouse for my theme music and Mr. Exploress for my logo. Until next time.